Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story will tell about a girl who did not know that fate had prepared something more for her than an ordinary, boring life. On the day when Irene first saw the man who would radically change her life, she had no idea that Duke Ethan was the head of a family whose name was revered and feared throughout the northern continent. However, before this meeting, the man visited the emperor, who had a very important conversation with him. The man said that he understood very well how difficult it was to be under the influence of relatives abroad. And when he made him his offer, he immediately asked what Duke Ethan thought about it. In fact, this young guy, who was dressed in an amazing military uniform, was the head of the family of sea guardians. While the northern continent was protected by the imperial family, the Duchy of Utter guarded its misty sea at the southern gate. At that time, rather strange forces in the fog created very unusual events, a place where grotesque monsters, unseen within the country, ran without even looking back. And while they all continued to fight off such monsters, the influence of the I-10 family only grew each time. These events prompted the imperial family to begin keeping the Iter family under control, and that was why the emperor summoned this young man to negotiate. As they stood there in silence after talking for a while, the emperor thought that they couldn't just stand by and watch the Ethan family continue to expand. He had summoned Ethan in order to marry him, as the heir, to the daughter of a powerless family in order to reduce their influence on the continent many times over. But in fact, Ethan was not at all surprised when the emperor called him to him and told him the entire agenda, because their intentions were quite clear and transparent. Therefore, after a short silence, he said that it would be very good if some family proposed to him, then he would definitely marry their daughter. After the man returned to his homeland, he immediately began to receive various proposals of engagement. He was going through whole stacks of different options, and then suddenly he saw Baroness Levios and thought that he had heard of her somewhere before, and also assumed that she was the firstborn, who was already turning 20 years old, but she was still not married. Of course, it doesn't matter who this bride is, because he, of course, didn't like married life at all. He didn't see himself in it, and therefore didn't want to waste his time on unnecessary people. He just thought it would be a pretty big blessing if she didn't run away, suffocating in the cold, damp air of the fog, after he accepted her proposal. However, when he actually accepted her offer and this girl came to his estate, the man was incredibly surprised by the person he saw. Ethan was dressed quite smartly because this meeting was quite important, and when he opened the carriage, he was very surprised, because in front of him sat a little girl in a wedding dress and with a bouquet. The little girl herself, looking at the man who met her, immediately thought that this was probably the very same person she had come to see. Of course, it was a little surprising to her that in front of her stood that same formidable duke who wanted to marry a 5-year-old child. In fact, this was already the girl's second life, and in the previous one she was a commoner who also could not enter the magic academy. And with the sole determination to rise up, she taught herself magic, and eventually reached the position of even the great mage of the empire. During this time, she was able to join forces with her comrades from the magic tower. They were able to defeat the evil dragon that made all nations tremble in fear. And at the moment when she already thought that everything was over, the girl was betrayed by the comrade whom she trusted more than anything in the world. When they finally managed to defeat the dragon, he just meanly took and pushed her straight into the hot lava. Of course, the girl was incredibly shocked then, and did not understand how Rayton could do such a thing because she was so close to him. In fact, after that she thought about how her life, filled with regret, ended with the betrayal of her teammate and even friend. But she was wrong, because very soon the girl opened her eyes and heard someone talking not far from her. There were two men. One of them was a doctor, and next to him stood the girl's father. He asked him in an anxious voice whether the palace doctor would be able to cure Natasha's illness. The doctor, who had already carefully examined the girl, said that if he brewed and gave her a special herb, she would not die immediately. The man immediately asked where he could get this medicinal herb. After that, the doctor handed him a map and said that this type of herb grows only in the coastal border zone, and its price is quite high. Sometime after her awakening, Natasha realized that she had been reborn into the family of Baron Levios, and that she was his daughter. She thought that this was not bad, because in this case, everyone from head to toe would court her, and everything would be completely different. However, at this point, a woman who was on edge interrupted the men's conversation. She said that this was absurd and that they could not afford such an expensive item on a regular basis. The woman yelled at her husband and asked him what he was doing, since this was the child he had with the maid. So the woman thought he should handle it himself and not endanger the whole family. The man immediately tried to calm her down and said that she knew that they, of course, did not have that kind of money, and they would simply have to give up on saving this girl. Of course, Natasha was given a new life as the daughter of a baronial family. However, since the mana that surrounded her heart was still the mana of a great mage, her childish body certainly could not withstand all of this. After her father abandoned her, the Baroness began to mistreat the poor girl. She forbade her to go outside, claiming that her illness could be contagious, and so simply locked her in the estate. So her mana just battered her young and small heart, and so her health only got worse because of it. So poor Natasha had to endure this pain every day. However, one day something unusual happened. Suddenly, her stepmother burst into her room with her maids, and she ordered them to do something about the child's terrible scars. They immediately grabbed poor Natasha and began to shade her scars, thereby covering them up. The girl tried to break away from them, but it was useless. They held her tightly. Then she, screaming, asked what they were doing, because she really did not understand. Some time passed from that moment, and one of the maids suddenly turned to Madame and said that this child was coughing up blood. No matter what they did, it did not stop. The woman immediately frowned. She didn't like it. Then she said that perhaps the girl was trying to deliberately resist her illness. Natasha's stepmother also explained that they had to make sure that no blood got on her clothes when they dressed her, because the white wedding dress should not be damaged. As soon as Natasha heard this, she was immediately very surprised. She did not understand why they decided to put a wedding dress on her. The girl was truly horrified. However, her stepmother finally decided to explain what was going on and said that from that day on, she would become a new bride for one man. When the girl asked who this man was, the stepmother replied that she was marrying a duke and would then leave for another city. It was in this way that the little girl now stood next to the grown man, who was in a stupor due to the shock that had overwhelmed him. They both just stood there and looked at each other in silence for a while, because no one understood what was going on. Then, finally, he spoke first. He looked at the guard who was escorting the girl and said that they could not seriously claim that this child was his bride. The man understood perfectly well why Mr. Ethan had such a reaction, but he said that his family had already accepted this offer, so they had no way back. Ethan said that was indeed the case. However, no one, of course, could have expected that they would choose a small child who had only recently learned to stand for marriage. The knight persisted and said that if Ethan sent the girl back in this way, the bride would bear the shame of the annulment for the rest of her life. The guy immediately frowned at that moment and said that the prank that the Levios family had pulled off would certainly never be forgotten by him, so they would still pay for their actions. Immediately after that, Ethan turned back to the girl. At that moment, she thought that he was very handsome, but she did not like it at all because she did not know what would happen next. Ethan was silent again for a while. After that, he asked the girl for forgiveness and said that he needed literally a minute to think about it. Natasha was shocked. However, she only nodded in response and waited for what would happen next. Then the man got down on one knee and took her hands in his. She looked at him with her large but childish eyes and thought that the scent that emanated from him was quite familiar to her. And at that moment, she finally understood why he was familiar to her, because it was the scent of a sea creature. Ethan was a sea creature, and it was immediately noticeable. The man took her small hands in his and continued to hold them. In fact, the pain she was experiencing was completely incomparable to the surrounding pain in her heart. And yet it was still quite strange for her when someone else looked at her like that. He didn't take his eyes off her, and because of this, Natasha became very uncomfortable. She quickly took her hands away from him and turned away. And right there, at that moment, he became even more angry. After all, he simply did not know how to behave. After a while of silence, he gritted his teeth and said in a quiet voice that he was still accepting the young lady as a member of his family. When Natasha heard this, she was genuinely surprised. She was filled with hope that he would not go through with this marriage. However, this man actually agreed to this marriage with a 5-year-old girl. Ethan then suddenly said that she could become a member of his family only if the young lady agreed to become his adopted daughter. Natasha, hearing that he wanted to adopt her, was very surprised. However, for her, of course, this was the best way out of the situation. She had come a long way to meet him after all. However, she was also curious about his true motive for all of this. In his past life, Rayton also told her that he wanted to kill the evil dragon for the greater good. However, he ended up killing her because he wanted to engrave the entire title of Dragon Slayer into himself and be praised for the rest of his life. However, when she looked at his eyes filled with hope, she began to even doubt that this man could wish her harm. Natasha clenched her little fist and thought that even if she rejected this offer, she still would not be able to return to the Baron's house. Until her heart was stable, she decided that she could stay as his adopted daughter for a while and didn't see anything wrong with that. So, in a very confident voice, the girl said that she agreed to go for it. Natasha also added that she would accept absolutely any decision, even if she is not adopted as a daughter and becomes an ordinary servant. She is ready to agree to this option. However, at that moment she did not have time to finish the last sentence, because the girl felt ill and simply lost consciousness. Because of this, Natasha, of course, could not stay on her feet and fell straight into the arms of Ida, who was incredibly surprised, not understanding what was happening at all. The man was so worried about her that he immediately started shouting, and then he turned to his servants to hurry up and call a doctor. It was for this reason that Natasha decided to stay with him, because she simply knew that she would be thrown out into the street and die there. Some time passed since then, and the girl finally regained consciousness. Natasha immediately sat up in bed and looked around. She saw luxurious apartments and noticed that this room was very spacious. For a while, she didn't even understand where she was. However, at that moment, she heard the voice of some pleasant woman who shouted that the young lady had woken up, and they asked that everyone be informed about it immediately. When Natasha heard this voice, she was very surprised because she thought she was alone in the room. However, at that moment, a young girl came up to her and asked if she knew where this place was. When the girl raised her head up and saw a beautiful woman in front of her, who, smiling, said that her name was Azalta. The woman also explained that from now on, she would serve Lady Natasha. The girl was silent for a while, after which she asked in a sad voice that the woman treat her kindly. However, Azalta replied that she did not have to treat her in such a formal tone, because she would now be like a friend to her. Natasha, hearing this, was a little surprised, but said that since it had to be that way, she would do it that way. The woman then explained that the furniture was meant for adults, so it might be a little uncomfortable for a little one like her. Azalta also said that she shouldn't worry, because very soon everything will be made according to her order, so she just needs to be patient for a while, and everything will work out around her. Smiling, the woman said that no one could have imagined that Baron Livia could be so crazy. She said the last phrase in a very quiet voice, because she understood that she could be punished for this. However, Natasha heard all this perfectly and only smiled in response. Azalta then said that the owner had prepared a special gift for her, which she should give to her. As soon as the little girl heard about it, she was very surprised. After that, the woman gave her this gift and said that Geoscent was very caring and put a lot of care into it. Azalta had a huge lollipop in her hands, which she could barely hold with one hand. However, the woman smiled happily and was looking forward to seeing the girl's reaction. Natasha was so shocked at that moment that she couldn't even react. She just stood there with her mouth open and didn't know what it was. The woman immediately said in a joyful voice that it was a very sweet candy for her, and the girl, hearing about it, now immediately guessed what it was. She was so shocked by what she saw that she even fell to the floor. In fact, Natasha had never seen such big candies in her life, and even to her it looked more like a shield than a caramel. The girl understood perfectly well that she had reacted too sharply to all of this, so she needed to calm down a little. However, she couldn't do anything about it. Natasha was very surprised when her new teacher saw this. She immediately pressed her to her and asked if everything was okay with her, and also said that the doctor would come very soon to examine her. Natasha, as soon as she heard about the doctor, was immediately very surprised. In fact, in her past life, she was not so close with doctors, but they really liked to read her various lectures about her health. However, at that moment, the girl assumed that they would most likely start scolding her now for being so scared because of the candy. She even became scared because of this. In fact, the reason Natasha felt bad was because her body was too weak to properly process the mana that was in it, and she understood perfectly well that if she tried to calm down now, her health would improve. And after some time, her breathing immediately became even and calm, so she turned to the woman and said that everything was fine with her and she really felt better. Azalta, hearing this, immediately became worried. She was about to say something, but at that moment, someone knocked on the door. Natasha immediately said that they could come in. Then the worried doctor ran into the room and told the young lady that he was very pleased to meet her. After that, he introduced himself. He immediately came closer to her. This man's name was Delfiro, and he asked if everything would be all right if he started with the examination immediately. Natasha, meanwhile, continued to stand in place. At first she was a little worried, but she took a few deep breaths again, and holding her caramel, looked at the doctor. Delfiro, when he saw such a big candy, first thought it was a shield. However, she looked very cute next to him, and he thought that this thing suited her very well. They stood in silence for a while, but after that the doctor decided not to waste time and to begin the examination. He turned to Azalta and said that she would handle the stethoscope, since he could not do so according to etiquette. The woman smiled happily and said that of course she would do everything. Then the doctor turned away and immediately began listening to the girl's breathing. In fact, he did this because a noble young lady cannot be examined directly by a male doctor. So, to comply with all the rules, they involved her governess in the matter as well. Some time passed since then, and the doctor finally turned to them again and said that the Leviola family had not expressed any specific concerns regarding her health. However, now that he has examined Natasha carefully, he can conclude that she has been a bit weak in body and health since birth. The girl was not at all surprised and said that this was indeed the case, and the doctor immediately asked if she knew about this and also asked if her family had indicated any treatment. Natasha felt very uncomfortable about all this. However, bowing, the doctor said that he would see to it that she began to feel better, because if he did not take care of it now, very soon she would not even be able to go anywhere without pain. But the girl immediately protested and said that there was absolutely no need for this. In fact, she understood perfectly well that if they could not read her mana during the test, they would not be able to fix it. So, seeing the surprised look on the doctor's face, she said that as long as she felt well enough to have fun and live life, that was enough for her. Delfiro, when he heard these words, even became a little sad because he could not accept the fact that such a little girl had to live with pain, and also that she refused treatment. This situation even made him a little angry. His hand suddenly started shaking from anger, and he told her not to give up under any circumstances, and also convinced her that he, as a qualified doctor, would definitely ensure her recovery. Natasha was about to say something, but he interrupted her and said that if she felt even the slightest discomfort, she should immediately tell him about it. The man also added that after a few days of preparation, they would conduct a more detailed examination, so she should not overexert herself until then. When Natasha heard this, she was surprised. She couldn't believe that she seriously looked like a person who gave up on life after being told that she was terminally ill. So the girl thought that she needed to become strong enough to control her mana, that's all. She not was going to give up or more something. Before leaving, the doctor also said that wherever she wanted to go, she should definitely take Azalta with her. And after that, he wished her all the best, and bowing, left. When the door closed, Azalta sat down next to Natasha and smiling, asked if she wanted to see and try the candy that the Duke had given her. They already finished inspection. Natasha, hearing about this, was immediately very surprised, and looking at the woman asked, "Can I really eat this?" Her nanny picked up a hammer and said that of course she could do it, and asked the girl to give her a minute to prepare. She looked at it with a very surprised look, and at first thought that she was about to be beaten. However, after some time she guessed what the hammer was for. Her nanny broke the candy and put some pieces on her plate, immediately telling her that now she could enjoy it, it was much more convenient to eat it that way. At that moment, Natasha concluded for herself that Azalta was definitely an unusual servant, and she had hidden abilities that could not be immediately noticed. However, she had been quite good to the girl for now, and so this was a little surprising to her. In fact, Azalta understood perfectly well that despite the fact that the head of the house officially adopted her as his daughter, it was her duty to be attentive and careful in relation to strangers with whom Natasha communicated. However, for a while it even seemed to her that Delfiro had fallen head over heels in love with the young lady, because she really was simply charming, and he even held back his tears so as not to burst into tears in front of her from sadness. However, despite all this, the woman felt obliged to remain vigilant and not lose her attention, so she was always focused on the baby. However, to her great surprise, Natasha suddenly took a few pieces of caramel and said that she would like to share this candy with her. As soon as Azalta saw this, she was very surprised. She could not believe that the girl really wanted to share with her. For a while, the nanny just looked at her and tried to understand whether the girl was really serious, and also thought that she was an incredibly sweet and generous little girl. So Azalta happily took this caramel and thanked her, saying that she was really very pleased. However, unfortunately, because Natasha ate this caramel on an empty stomach, she could not digest this candy, and she felt sick, so she vomited. When the nanny realized what the matter was, she helped wipe the baby's mouth and said that it would be better to stop at porridge for now, and also added that she would definitely make sure that it was as tasty as possible and not disgusting. But it really hurt her to see Natasha in such a state, because she could imagine how long the girl had to go hungry, since she had already vomited everything from the first piece of candy. And it was at that moment that Azalta's anger towards the baby's father became even more wrathful, because she did not understand how it was possible to bring the child to such a terrible state. When evening came, the Duke's assistant came to his office, and the man asked in surprise, "Did the Libo family really send them a letter by mail?" The assistant bowed and said that it was indeed so. The nightly order they had sent had not returned, and so they had no choice but to send the letter. Ethan immediately knew what was going on, because a few days ago, several famous corpses were found in the woods, and he realized that they were most likely sent by the Liboa family. He was also incredibly surprised by the fact that they couldn't even cope with weak monsters, and it was implied that they were knights and should protect people from even stronger opponents. Ethan couldn't believe that they actually wrote in the letter that they wanted to set a schedule for the wedding vows, even though the bride had arrived quite safely. Of course, the man was very angry about all this, and he could not believe that these people not only sent him a 5-year-old bride, but also thought that he would accept this child as his wife and not even ask any questions. Therefore, without thinking twice, the Duke immediately squeezed this letter in his hand and threw it into the fire that was burning in the fireplace. The assistant immediately understood what was going on and said that he still couldn't believe that such people existed at all, and also added that he would write a response on his behalf so that he wouldn't have to go through all this even more. However, the man forbade him to do this and said that he would write the letter himself and that he should not interfere in this situation at all. He explained his point of view by saying that this now concerns the child of his family, so he must make decisions on all this on his own. In the letter, he wrote that until this child renounced his last name, she would not have the opportunity to leave this family again. So only when she herself wanted to, she would be able to renounce his help. He also mentioned in the letter that Natasha was now part of his family, but not as a bride, but as his daughter, so they had to keep that in mind in the future. Of course, there was no need to adopt her to formally hold Eden accountable for the deception, and if a feud over territory arose, he would be able to answer for the insults and restore his honor. However, in reality, Ethan insisted on adopting this child for a completely different, more compelling reason. In fact, he saw something extraordinary in this child, and that is why he committed such an act, perhaps stupid but quite responsible. At that moment, the doctor, who had just finished all his business, suddenly came into the man's office and asked the Duke if he had called him. Ethan noticed him and immediately greeted him, and also asked if it was true that he was preparing for a detailed examination of the child. He also said that he thought it would take a little longer than expected. However, it would have to happen anyway. The doctor had already bowed. He also said that he felt that her heart had become so small that a detailed examination would be difficult. He had the feeling that something might be squeezing it hard, and that was what was causing her pain. He also added that he had heard that recently she had begun to give the candy that the Duke had given her to various servants and had hardly eaten it herself. He also admitted to the Duke that at first he actually even thought that it was some kind of shield, but in the end it turned out not to be so, and even added that the girl gave him a few pieces of caramel. Ethan was genuinely surprised when he heard that he thought it was a shield, and also wondered if there was any problem with her doing that. The doctor explained that, naturally, everyone wanted to try the young lady's candy, but when the servants all gathered, she was very worried and was really scared. When a lot of people gathered around the little girl, expecting something from her, she really didn't know what to do and how to be. Her nanny also conveyed information that she was most afraid of the large shadow of an adult. Her body would start to tremble. For a while, the dolphin was silent, and then said that it seemed to him that the time spent in the Baron's house had been more difficult for her than expected, and that this had caused her a trauma that was now giving its signs. Ethan actually thought about it himself, and after that, he said that he needed to let her know that she didn't have to worry about it anymore, that everything would be fine with her now, and that no one would let her be hurt. However, he did not fully know how he could do this, but still decided to think about it, so that the girl would no longer suffer, but enjoy her wonderful young life. At this time, Natasha was lying in her bed without sleep. Despite the fact that it was already quite late, there were many different thoughts around her, because of which she could not fall asleep. In fact, her room had changed dramatically after only a few days of her stay in this estate, and Natasha could not understand why they were all so kind to her, giving her a lot of toys and children's things. She assumed that most likely it was all done because of the mana that she possessed. The doctor always tried to support her and said that he saw success in the progress of her health and was really happy about it. In fact, Natasha believed that if they had come in her past life and started to support and help her, then of course she would not have been against it and would even have started to open up to these people. However, after being betrayed by the person closest to her in her past life, she came to the conclusion that she could not allow this life to end with such betrayal and regret. Of course, all these people who surrounded her were much better than those in her home, but still, until she knew the Duke's true intentions, she would not be able to trust anyone. Several hours passed from that moment, and when Natasha opened her eyes the next time, she saw some servant in front of her, who asked if she was awake yet. The girl was a little surprised to see her, but she began to cover herself with a blanket and asked them to let her sleep a little longer, because in fact she barely slept the night before. The maid, of course, did not object, and replied that in that case she would clean her room while she lay down for a while and rested. Natasha was a little surprised by this, but she made sure that the maid did not notice what she was about to do and immediately stood up. She was immediately glad that she couldn't make a single loud sound, and she was going to go explore the area before someone found out about it and started looking. It was still quite dark outside, so it was very easy for Natasha to hide around the estate, and when she left the room, she immediately looked from side to side to check if anyone was standing there. After this, Natasha very slowly left the room and went into a passage from which she immediately found herself on the street. But then suddenly she saw a small glow from her hands and was very surprised. Then she activated a little of her power and immediately thought that it was most likely mana fog. Of course, her body was still suppressing this energy, but she could feel mana beginning to fill her with every breath. Of course, she went straight ahead in order to find something, but with such a thick fog, it was quite difficult for her to navigate the area. It took Natasha some time before she finally found those rare elixir herbs that were scattered throughout the estate like weeds. As soon as she got closer, she noticed that even they were incredibly strongly imbued with mana, and assumed that this thing could be used as a material for magic stones. The girl simply beamed with joy and said that this place was a real paradise for her. She was also surprised that such expensive treasures were simply growing on the ground around, and no one even tried to protect them. Then she suddenly felt uncomfortable and immediately thought that someone was watching her. But when she looked around, she decided to use her abilities to get these herbs as easily as possible. Natasha activated her magical energy and immediately saw that by using the mana from the fog instead of her internal mana, she could even fly like a witch. The girl also felt incredible relief throughout her body due to the fact that all the excess energy began to leave there. After that, she cast an invisibility spell to hide her body, and Natasha actually managed to do it. So now she was going to explore the area where the fog was much thicker in order to see the whole territory without any obstacles. After some time, walking along the beach, she reached the place where the fog was thickest. As she got closer to the huge mollusk, she noticed that it was under the influence of mana, but she still didn't understand how it could have grown so huge. Looking inside, she noticed something strange, and thought that it was most likely a muscle part. However, it was completely dried out, and she assumed that it could even be used as a table. So, with a lot of effort, Natasha was able to climb inside this shell and immediately laid out all her herbs on the dried muscle part to make it a little easier for her. In fact, she felt incredibly happy at that moment and assumed that it was most likely because she finally felt energetic in her heart again, and besides, it started beating a little faster, and she felt better. The girl laughed loudly and thought that it was all just wonderful, because she felt free and decided that from now on this huge shell would be her refuge when she wanted to take a break from everyone. However, at that moment something unexpected happened, and all because the top of this mollusk closed with a crash, and Natasha realized that this was clearly not a good sign. She was genuinely very scared and immediately tried to open it, but of course she did not have enough strength to lift even the top of such a huge shell. She couldn't believe that she was now actually trapped inside this mollusk, and she even found it difficult to breathe for a while. In fact, her already fragile heart almost stopped from shock, but she immediately began to use breathing techniques to calm down, because she shouldn't panic so much. When she finally managed to balance her breathing, Natasha suddenly saw something bright begin to rise right before her eyes. She immediately looked up and was very surprised, because together with this small ball of light, she also lifted off the ground and flew up. She immediately realized that it didn't look like any spell that someone had set up separately, and Natasha assumed that it had most likely formed naturally when she appeared there. Natasha couldn't take her eyes off this flying bright ball and thought that it was simply delightful, and also knew that she should not lose it under any circumstances. By being able to absorb the mana fog in that area, the girl gained even more strength and energy and was able to draw a small field around herself. She was able to set up detection spells with this circle, and now she would immediately know if anyone came even a centimeter closer to this shell. The girl considered this a reliable protection because now she would immediately receive an alarm when someone appeared in this shell. However, at that moment she tried to touch this flying ball, but it very quickly dodged her, as if it knew what she was going to do. Natasha was very upset about this because she could not believe that she really would not be able to even touch him in any way. And the moment she tried to do it again, the ball suddenly just disappeared. It dissolved into thin air. At that very moment, Natasha saw how this mollusk began to open, and immediately heard the screams of people and silhouettes around her. After the shell was completely opened, she immediately saw her nanny, and with tears in her eyes moved closer to her. Azalto immediately ran to her and told her that she was incredibly happy that she was able to find her. After that, she began to hug her and told them to all escort the lady back to the estate. Some time had indeed passed since then, and Natasha was taken back to her bedroom. In fact, the moment when everyone suddenly started walking around her surprised the girl even more than when the shell snapped shut, because she didn't expect that she could scare these people so much. After all, she even saw tears in the eyes of one of the maids. Natasha knew perfectly well that she was probably very valuable to the Duke, and that was the reason he had sent all these people to look for her. However, she did not think that they would be sincerely concerned about her well-being. The nanny who brought her to the bed immediately said that it was an unusually large mollusk that had grown unnaturally due to the inhalation of a strange fog. So she warned the girl and said that she had better not go there again. Natasha, hearing about something strange, immediately became interested. However, her nanny asked if she even imagined how much everyone was worried about her, and immediately began to think of bad things that could happen to her because of this time. The girl immediately asked in a surprised voice, "Is this really true?" And her nanny said that, of course, absolutely everyone, having immediately discovered her disappearance, began to search. In fact, in her past life, the girl always had to throw herself into danger to save someone else's life, and she had never had anyone worry about her well-being in life. She looked at Azelta and realized that this particular woman would not be able to get anything from her, so she even assumed that these words from the nanny were truly sincere. The girl was silent for a while, then asked why this woman was showing such concern for her, and also why she liked her. Her nanny was a little surprised at first, because she didn't think that Natasha would be interested in such questions. However, after of this, she smiled. Azelta sat down next to her and said that it was all because the girl had given her something precious. After that, she took a handkerchief from her pocket, in which were several pieces of caramel. The woman explained that it was for this reason that she simply had to serve her with all her heart. At that moment, Natasha smiled and thought that candies really could work miracles, but she didn't believe that this could somehow work to her advantage. The effect of this candy was incredible for her, and she wanted to gather up the courage to share this candy with a few more people. In fact, this act later became the source of the clan of 8 candies, and it all started with little Natasha, who simply shared a piece of caramel with her nanny. Before washing the young lady, Azelta also said that it would be better for her to just wash her hands and face, and then get some more rest, since she probably hadn't gotten enough sleep because of everything that had happened. Natasha, of course, didn't object. However, she still found it all rather strange, since she had definitely used an invisibility spell when she moved. So it remained a big mystery to her how they were able to find her so quickly when she was inside that big shell. Several hours passed since then, and Natasha was actually able to fall asleep. The sun had already risen outside when she finally woke up. The girl sat up on the bed and immediately saw that Azelta was nearby. She turned to her to something ask. The nanny immediately stopped and asked the girl what she wanted. Then Natasha pointed towards the exit and asked who this person was who was hiding like that. Azelta immediately replied that it was Soroti, and he was ordered to guard this place now, so what he will stand there almost all time. Natasha immediately stood up from her seat to look closely at this man, and was truly surprised that they took such measures. Azelta, meanwhile, began to make her bed, and turning to the maid, asked her to come and bring the knight for a few minutes. The maid did so immediately. In fact, Natasha was surprised, because she did not want to meet him. However, at that moment, a young man with blonde hair entered the room. And when Natasha saw him, she was a little surprised. He immediately spoke to her and introduced himself. The guy said his name was Radio Diaz, and he was now serving as her bodyguard by order of the Duke, so they were bound to cross paths quite often now. When Natasha looked closely at this young man, she noticed that he had a mystical eye. In fact, the mystic eye allows its owner to see intangible mana, and they have much better vision than others. However, temporarily are losing your own vision when very strongly get tired. The magician can see the owner's memories by looking into his mystical eye. And on the one hand, this is very good, but on the other hand, it can be his weakness. However, when Natasha looked at her new knight, she was very surprised, because it was the purest and most powerful mystical eye of all that she had ever seen. However, at that moment she also realized that since his eyes were quite clear, she could try to look into his memories. To her will succeed do much easier than usually. However, now she at least understood why the invisibility spell had no effect on them at all. It was because they had guessed that she had disappeared and were immediately able to see where she was going. These knights also valued this to the Duke, and if they wanted, they could find and reveal her secret plans in the blink of an eye. So now Natasha even became a little ashamed because she used this invisibility spell, because it was completely useless in the future as well. Then suddenly her nanny noticed that something had happened to her mood, and immediately turning to her lady, asked if everything was all right with her. Natasha remained silent for a while. However, after that, she turned to the knight and asked for forgiveness for looking away. She explained that his eyes were shining so brightly that it even hurt her a little to look at them. Azelta intervened in their conversation before the knight could say anything and said that his eyes were a hereditary trait from birth, and everyone in Sir Rhodey's family had the same eyes. As soon as Natasha heard about this, she immediately beamed with joy and thought that this amazing mystical eye was not created artificially. It was passed down from generation to generation. She looked at the man again and said that they were incredibly beautiful and looked like expensive stones. I liked it. In fact, Natasha was a little ashamed of the way she said this information because she had just met this person, and it was very impolite of her to act like that. So she immediately asked him for forgiveness and told him to take very good care of her in the future because she didn't want to get into trouble. At that moment, Rhodia got down on one knee, took the girl's hand, and said with confidence in his voice that he would devote his entire body and soul to serving her faithfully and loyally. When the girl's nurse heard all this, she immediately smiled and said that she did not think that her lady was bothered by Sir Rothy's eyes, and this was a great relief to her. Natasha was a little surprised to hear this. However, she suddenly thought about it after the nanny mentioned it. She turned her attention to the maid who was standing nearby and noticed that Mara felt uncomfortable around this man, and this was quite surprising for the girl. She even suggested that in this place people do not like mystical eyes, and perhaps even despise people who have this gift. After Rotia returned to his chambers, when he had finally spoken with the girl, he was suddenly overwhelmed by not very pleasant memories and feelings. In fact, after one incident, people started discussing that Rhodey's father had killed the madam. However, the man tried to prove to them that it was not the madam at all, but a monster, and he had to do it. Even all the servants in the manor kept talking about him. It was strange for them to understand the fact that even after his father had already committed this terrible act, he still tried to prove his innocence by saying that Madame was a monster. But they are, of course, same in all this not believed. It's not. They didn't understand how he was able to kill her in the end, because it was immoral in their opinion, but what scared them even more was that Roti had exactly the same crazy eyes as his father. However, at that moment the boy heard a young voice addressing him, and he immediately stopped being in his evil memories. Rodia looked down and saw a small boy talking to him. He asked him what he was thinking about so deeply. He immediately hugged the boy and asked, "Has Frey really come to congratulate him?" And also asked how he was feeling and what was on his mind in general. The boy tried to push it away and said that he was actually fine. Then he smiled and added that since he had to get to the door, he had to go outside. It was an integral part. He asked, "Will it be all right if he comes out right here?" The man thought about it, but said that even though the fog was too thick, he didn't need to worry because he would be right next to him, so everything should go well. Frey was a little surprised when he heard about this. However, he then smiled and said that he would walk exactly as much as the man told him, so as not to overdo it and feel good. Rotia replied that they would only go as long as necessary. After that, they went out into the yard, and the boy asked what had brought his brother such a good mood that day, because he really was beaming with joy. The man thought for a moment, then said that one person had told him that he was beautiful, and immediately laughed and asked, "Did that person really say that?" Rocha replied that this was indeed the case, but he clarified that he meant that his eyes were beautiful. Hearing about this, he was immediately very surprised. He froze in place, because he had exactly the same gorgeous golden eyes. The guy stood there silently for a while, and then asked who had told him such a thing, because he was really interested. And the man explained that it was a young lady who had recently arrived in this place. He suddenly smiled and said that she told him that they were like jewels, beautiful and just as bright. When Frey heard this, he was very surprised and could not believe that the young lady actually said this, and in a low voice, he said that he would also like to hear such words one day. In fact, after the man officially met Natasha, she felt more comfortable communicating with him, and even always wanted to spend more time with him. The girl was really happy that now next to her was a person who had such beautiful eyes, and she would like to see them much more often. In fact, when she looked into them, she immediately thought of sand and grass, and even in this city, his eyes were like peeling an onion from its skin in order to find the hidden charm in this beautiful object. However, at that moment, Natasha suddenly felt a little strange, and it was because someone had gotten into that huge shell, because she had put a protective sign there. It was instantly torn apart by a huge force, and the girl really hoped that they wouldn't find out that she had created a special magic circle to know when someone entered. She even suggested that if anyone started asking about it, they would simply say that it had already happened before she got there. However, despite all this, Natasha understood perfectly well that she could not stay in this place forever. She had to explore and learn more about this world in order to simply survive in it. So when the nanny came to see her the next day, she declared her desire, and the girl asked in surprise, "Does she really want to read some books in the library?" The girl beamed with joy and said that it was indeed so. She would like to watch something with lots of pictures and words about beautiful trees and the sky. Of course, her nanny didn't object and said that she would bring one for her now, so she had to wait a little in her room. Of course, Natasha was immediately happy when she heard about this, because they could bring her a book about the climate or vegetation of the continent, or at least something close to all of this. However, when Azalta returned, all her dreams were shattered, and she was not even surprised that they brought her a children's book. It was quite obvious because she was now just a little girl. She also thought that it was a good thing that she had learned to read before she was thrown into this place, because now she could read everything quickly, and she wouldn't have to waste time on simply learning these things. And then, one day Natasha continued reading one of the books and suddenly noticed something strange. There was a picture of the emperor and a caption that Milan was the first to ban magic. Of course, she was incredibly surprised then, and could not believe that magic was actually once prohibited and inaccessible as it is now. The girl quickly began to read what was written there, and the book explained that Emperor Milan could no longer tolerate the oppression of magicians, and so he simply banned magic throughout the continent. And while some secretly used magic, hiding from everyone, the imperial family ensured that such people would be caught and punished for disobedience. In his opinion, magic was incredibly dangerous by its nature, and all captured magicians had to be completely destroyed so that other people would not suffer from it. After that, a small fairy appeared in the book, who was leading this very story and told the children who were supposed to read this book that I should also worry, because these magicians would definitely be executed, and they should never bother other people again. Natasha was truly shocked. She couldn't believe that people were actually executed just because they were mages and different from everyone else. This law wasn't just about her being forbidden to use. If they had discovered her mana, she would have been dead long ago, and she hadn't even used it in any way, since she hadn't yet learned to control it well enough. Natasha was shocked. She immediately remembered about that magic circle in the shell and doubted what she should do now, because it could easily be discovered, and after some time everything would lead to her. At that moment, her nanny suddenly came up to her and noticed that something was strange about her. She immediately asked, "Did she really not like this book?" Natasha tried to calm down so that the girl would not suspect anything strange, and immediately said in a trembling voice that it was indeed a very interesting book, and she was grateful to her for it. But after that, she suddenly yawned and lay down on the bed, saying that she was very sleepy, so she replied that she would like to take a little nap before continuing her reading. Azalta took the book from her and, smiling, said that of course she could rest, and also wished her sweet dreams. At that moment, Natasha glanced at her nanny and noticed that she was leaving. And that meant that when she finally fell asleep, everyone would leave the room, and she would be able to get to where she needed to go. The girl knew that this would give her a chance to escape with the help of invisibility magic. However, at this moment she suddenly understood my error. The mistake was that she had completely forgotten about the Rotia, which was still standing outside the door. In fact, she had really hoped that he would just go and have a quick bite, since she had gone to bed anyway, and in her opinion, there was no need to keep an eye on him at all. After some time, Natasha crawled out from under the blanket and understood that she simply had no choice. She should not lose a great chance when she was alone in the room. Therefore, the girl was able to open the window with the help of magic, after which she turned herself invisible and even began to levitate. Of course, at first it was a little unusual for Natasha. However, when she flew to the window, she stopped for a while. Still, using two magical abilities at the same time was too much for her, and it was really very difficult. However, she knew that she had to hold on a little longer. After that, she put in all her efforts and still managed to get down from her high floor. Natasha knew she had to erase this magic circle before anyone discovered it, or she would come to find out she had already been exposed. Then, this will exactly not the best meeting. After some time, she finally reached this shell and, having cleared her throat, removed all her charms in order not to waste extra energy on them, and so that she would have the strength to return back later. But as soon as Natasha raised her head up, she noticed one person who was there, and she immediately recognized that it was Goetze. It really was like that, and he was sitting there in the shell, looking at the girl, and she was very surprised and did not understand how he ended up in this place, and most importantly, why. In fact, sometime before this, Eaton decided to go and check the place where Natasha was found. There was a strange fog near the sea, and he wanted to see everything with his own eyes. Walking through the forest, the man thought that he did not understand what the child was doing in this place. What could have interested her so far from the estate? In fact, he really hesitated there too. He was afraid to ask her, because the child with a round heart might even consider it an interrogation. Therefore, he had no other choice but to go to this place himself and check everything thoroughly. So after some time, he actually got to that place, and he remembered that it was the sea that had instilled fear in him since childhood. And it happened because one day, when his brother, who usually hated him, suddenly smiled unusually kindly and said that he hid the sword that the boy had wanted in himself for a long time. And this was how once again inside huge shells. Even though all the knights and servants present in the room at that moment giggled at his words, the boy had absolutely no idea what he meant, and so, of course, he believed him. The boy came to this huge shell with hope and climbed inside in search of his sword. He immediately thought that this was probably the thing his brother had mentioned. However, at the moment when he was about to look around, the shell suddenly snapped shut, and the boy became very scared. And only at that moment did Eaton begin to understand perfectly why his brother had sent him to this place, and why all the servants around had laughed when he said these words. And he was just in a panic there. He was sitting and crying inside this shell, of course. He was calling for help, for someone to come and get him out of this place, but no one was around. No one cared whether he would live or die. And that's why this place became quite traumatic for the man. But fortunately, when he came there to look around, the fog was not so thick yet. Because if it had happened, the child would have been in great danger. Natasha stood in front of him at that moment and thought that their eyes had met. However, she realized that this could not be, because as soon as she approached from the side and saw the Duke, she immediately cast the invisibility spell back. So, without thinking twice, she climbed inside, and Ethan meanwhile watched her actions with great surprise. He even stood up on legs and looked on her. At that moment, the girl realized that she had made a mistake, and even though she was using a spell that made her invisible, he still somehow noticed her. Natasha even started to panic a little, because she really hoped that she had mastered these spells very well, and only people with a magical eye could see her. In fact, in her past life, those who became good at swordsmanship could sense the magic of invisibility. This was something like they have instincts. However, even despite all this, they could only see faint flickers around them. They could not see the person completely. However, Natasha realized that Ethan saw her completely because he called her by name. The girl could not believe that the Duke was really such a skilled knight, that he had achieved such power and could notice her without hindrance. Ethan continued to look at her and asked in a worried voice, "Is this really her space?" The girl immediately said that it was not. In fact, she decided that she would simply cancel this invisibility because he still sees her perfectly well and understands who she is. They were both silent for a while. Then Ethan asked her why she brought sand to this place. The girl answered that it was all because it was clean and incredibly beautiful, and that was the reason she decided to bring it here. But then he looked at the middle of the shell and noticed some grass there, which had already dried up. He immediately wondered what she needed it for. The girl thought that the fact that she was a child played into her hands, so she simply replied that this grass was really very beautiful, and she couldn't just not take it. Of course, Ethan said he understood, and also agreed with her that the plant was beautiful. However, in reality, her purpose still remained a mystery to him. Natasha actually breathed a sigh of relief and thought that she had gotten away with it after all. She believed that the Duke had no prejudices when it came to beauty standards, so she was lucky that he didn't pick on her words and interrogate her even more. However, at that moment she suddenly followed his gaze and noticed that he was looking somewhere towards the sea, and this surprised her very much, because he was very focused on this matter. Natasha immediately began to look in the same direction, and now that she thought about it, she realized that there was much more fog in this place than when she came to this place before. In fact, the fog was really too thick, and Natasha could not even see those mountains that had previously been clearly visible. She immediately began to worry about this very much. But then the Duke suddenly turned to her and said that soon this fog would swallow the entire mansion, and all the monsters that lived beyond the sea would gather in this place. And unlike the land animals that she could see every day, sea animals are much more cunning and stronger. So what's wrong with them? Better jokes, not to joke. And there he also said that she herself would not even be aware of it, as this monster would appear before her in the form that she knew best. So he would not be able to come to this place often for a long time. However, he also said that if she wanted this to be her space, then so be it. He would not come to this place of his own free will, only with her permission and a request to me. Natasha was very surprised at this point. She couldn't believe that he was seriously saying that she could take this shell, and he wouldn't even visit her freely. In fact, absolutely everything in the estate belonged to the Duke of Eton, and she was completely useless to him now. So Natasha didn't understand why he was so kind to her, and even allocated her own space for privacy. However, overjoyed, she immediately turned to him and asked why he had accepted her into his family. Really was this very interesting. Ethan was silent for a while, then said that he had an older brother, and he believed that Ethan was a threat to the inheritance of the title of Duke. So he constantly tormented him with various humiliations, fights, and everything of that sort. And when the man succumbed to his lies and remained trapped in this shell, then, facing the horror of death, he then realized that of the many people in his family, no one had ever been on his side. Ethan always appeared alone, and no one ever supported him. So after this incident, he focused on developing his power alone. He accepted the situation as it was and did not resist. So because of this, his father chose him to be the next duke, and Ethan sent his brother and all his footmen away from the estate because he didn't want to have anything to do with them anymore. But he was always haunted by emptiness. So then he met her, a person who was at least a little bit like him and had similar feelings. And the moment he met her, he felt that he could give her something that he hadn't had as a child. He wanted to please her, and he thought that this would be a good opportunity for both of them. Eton also said that she could run away from the Baron's family, and if she wanted, she could distance herself from them forever. She could stay with him until she grew up and found her own path, and he wouldn't object. On the contrary, he would support her and help her in these endeavors. Natasha, when she heard all this, thought that it was really true. The conditions were mutually beneficial for them, although it would still be much more beneficial for him. In fact, at this point, Ethan began to doubt whether a 5-year-old child would even be able to understand such a difficult story that he told. So, embarrassed, he replied that she could ask him a little later, and he would definitely answer her any questions at any time. He also said that in any case she should not stay in this place for too long, and if she saw that the fog had become even thicker, then she had better quickly return to the estate before danger arose. After he told her these words, he turned around and walked away, leaving the girl alone. Of course, yes, Natasha was very surprised such kindness. Despite his skill level, she knew that he knew absolutely nothing about magic, and assumed that was most likely the reason why he didn't even realize that she was using invisibility. Natasha also concluded that this is indeed the world in which magic is strictly forbidden and is not taught to other people. However, even despite all this, from the first moment she arrived in this place, she felt incredibly calm. And this was very surprising for her, because in a world where magic is prohibited, she should have been afraid. But no. Some time passed from that moment, and when the girl came out of the forest, her knight immediately came and met her. He took her in his arms and began to lead her to the estate. Natasha also didn't understand since when it had become completely natural for her to rely on her knight, but this level of comfort was too good for her to give it up. Therefore, she not became object. The girl decided that in the end she liked looking at those beautiful eyes, so she didn't even mind that she and the knight began to get so close to each other. At that moment, as she was looking at him, the man turned around again and, smiling, said that her health had not fully recovered, so she had better not get too tired. The guy also said that if she was going to hide by climbing trees, he would like her to just call him along, and he would stand by and make sure nothing bad happened to her during that time.